Good afternoon, Friday afternoon, 4 o'clock, or just about. This is Steve Sabludowski, publisher by YouBuzz.com. Today we have a really interesting program, I believe. We're going to be talking Louisiana Legislature. Jim Brown and I are going to be grilling, mercilessly grilling our guest, Elizabeth Crisp, about what's going on up in Baton Rouge. Elizabeth, great having you for our first time. Jim is old hat at this. So tell us, how are you doing today?
Oh, good. It's Friday. We just made it through the second week of the regular session. So the Capitol was pretty empty today. I think a lot of people left out as soon as they could on Thursday.
Gotcha. Now, those people, I'm going to turn it over for Jim in a second to ask you a question or two. But if you're watching, make sure you go and share with others. Let everybody know that we're live talking about all that really important stuff going on up in Baton Rouge, Louisiana Legislature. Share and like, whether Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, you name it. So, Jim, how are you doing? And why don't you go ahead and I'm sure you got a burning question that you just dying to ask.
Well, I want to see Elizabeth as close observer. She writes regularly and covers the legislature. I was a senator back in 1970. In the 70s, we never had, there were words that took place, but after the session was over, everybody went out and socialized, stayed around Baton Rouge. Never any hard feelings, and never the division that you see right now. And quite frankly, I was a statewide official in the 80s and the 90s, and I've never seen such a time of despondence, of confrontation, of negative feelings that come on. I spoke last night, Elizabeth, to the Chamber of Commerce up in Concordia Parish across from Natchez, Mississippi, several legislators in attendance. And they said the same thing. They just said they're just so frustrated after the special session and now getting into the new session, to where right off the bat we've seen some very heavy vocal confrontations that I think your paper played out today, involving Senator Appel and legislation involving charter schools. Give us your view. Am I misjudging that, or is this really a very divisive time at the state capitol?
I've talked to a lot of members over the past week. I am working on a story that will be running in the Advocate this weekend about this topic. And just about everyone kind of gives the same analysis. When I ask them, do they feel like things are particularly tense right now or acrimonious, everybody says that, that they're feeling it. Monday night, the House was in session till after 8 o'clock at night on bills that you wouldn't think would keep them there on, a week into session that late at night. For anybody who knows how the legislature around here works, they don't tend to stay that late in the evening, especially not this early in the session. So and a lot of it was, you could tell it was just, there was tension at one point. Representative Ted James from here in Baton Rouge, from the well, he called for everybody to kind of just chill out a little bit because you could feel the tension in the room.
What do you think, if I could follow up with you on this, is the tension a anti-view, pro-view involving Governor John Bel Edwards? Do you sense, is it Republican versus Democrat? Where is the division? Is it black, white, or is it a combination of all those things?
I think that from talking to members, trying to get at this issue, people feel like it's just kind of all over the place. And more than anything, it's I think that there's some I spoke to one member who described it as right now they all kind of feel like they're in a hangover after the end of the special session, and it just collapsed so spectacularly, with nothing really coming out of it. They spent 2 weeks in the Capitol constantly trying to pass something, and nothing passed. And for some that was a victory to not pass anything, but for a lot it was just like, what were we even here for? So to now only have a couple of days off before they had to come back into the regular session, I think that everybody's just a little tired of being in the Capitol and kind of feeling like they're dealing with the same issues constantly. I mean, for 2 years, we've heard nothing but shortfall, shortfall, shortfall. It's always about $1 billion or something. And it just kind of seems like it's always the same debate, always the same argument. And I think that that's really what's kind of frayed some nerves.
So let's talk about the budget for a second. One of the things that I did a video with Rob Maness and last Friday, and basically the proposition of the discussion was that everything is, in a sense, in the Republican Party's hand. You know, they could cut $700 million if that's what, you know, the shortfall is, and if the governor calls a special session, then they don't have to vote for it because it's just going to be a majority rule vote. And so they're saying they want to cut. This would be the chance for them to cut to the bone. I'm not advocating they do so. So am I correct about that?
Yeah, and one of the questions right now is, how much is the shortfall? I talked to House Speaker Taylor Barra yesterday, and he says that on Monday he expects to really kind of start his planning for when he will call the next REC meeting to figure out what exactly is the latest budget projection. We know that there's going to be some boost to the state because of the federal tax rewrite and its impact on state revenue. So, we've seen the past 2 weeks, House Appropriations has brought all of the agency heads in to hear their budget requests, talk to them about how much money they need. So at least right now, the House Republicans do say that is what they're trying to do. You can leave it up to interpretation why that hasn't happened over the past 2 years. But I think before heading into another special session, they do want to see if there are some ways that they can cut the budget. Right now, there's just that question of how much is it. It's definitely not 994, which is the latest REC projection. But where is it? There's a lot of question there. I think that once you get that number, then you'll start seeing some more realistic look at cuts, probably.
What's your view about leadership there, Elizabeth? My experience has been that if the governor called a special session, he did so to address a problem and present a very specific solution. And the feeling is, and maybe the average viewer is misreading this, but I heard this last night in North Louisiana. I've heard it in New Orleans this week, that the governor said, hey, we got a shortfall. Let's call a special session and see what we can do. There was no really nuts and bolts specificity. And then following up Steve's question, often you would see, okay, Governor, we're not going to buy off on that. Here's our plan that you would expect from the Republican leadership. And the perception, at least, is that the Democrats under John Bel Edwards have failed to get very specific in terms of how they're going to fill the gap in a reasonable manner, knowing full well that we're not going to see $1 billion versus new taxes. And the Republicans have not offered the leadership to say, look, that's not right. Here's the gap we have to fill, and we're going to do it by going 1, 2, 3. Do you sense that there is that kind of leadership like we've seen in the past for both parties?
It's interesting. It does feel like, I don't know if it's a communication issue or what, but yeah, why would you have a governor call a special session without some assurance that something is actually going to happen, right? I mean, it falls on him too. And he constantly said, I'm not going to call a special session unless I feel like everybody's on board and we can pass something. So I'm not sure what the breakdown was there. And there is a disconnect. And when you talk to the House Speaker, he says, we always said, we would try to get, this, if you could get your people on board. And he has, pointed out that the issue over the sales tax, you had a lot of Democrats who were not in favor of that. And they did not feel that in good faith that there would be anything that they wanted if they went along with the sales tax proposal. So it really just kind of seemed like a breakdown on all sides. Nobody was really sure of what the other side wanted. Like you would expect going into a special session, usually these deals are, even though, you know, whether it's right or wrong, I mean, I'm somebody who I believe that, you know, the legislative process should go on in the public, and people should know what their elected officials are doing. But you know, the truth of it is, a lot of these deals go on behind the scenes, and so you wouldn't necessarily expect a 2-week special session to be called without already knowing what's going to happen in it.
So if anybody has a question, go ahead and post the question or comment, and I'll do my best to read them out. Likewise on Twitter, I'm going to be putting up some tweets in a few seconds dealing with these issues. As you probably remember, we communicated on Twitter last week or so. I had posted a article that we had pulled from WBOK radio, and basically the discussion was that there was actually, you know, division between, say, the within the Democrats, the Black Caucus versus the governor, and that the governor wanted, as in terms of a compromise, the governor wanted a half-cent compromise. And the Black Caucus said, no, we're not going to, in terms of sales tax, we're not going to go with that. You know, a lot of people, including myself, watching the governor at the end of the session, I mean, he didn't mention anything about that disagreement. You wrote about it, and a lot of people didn't write about it. And you heard a lot of Republicans say, wait a minute, it's not just us against the governor. The governor doesn't have his side together. Your take, please.
Yeah, you know, it was interesting at the governor's press conference at the end of the special session. The Black Caucus did join him in that press conference, and we've had several members of the Black Caucus who've made a point to, you know, speak from the floor, saying that they don't have issues with the governor, that, you know, they're very much in support of the governor. But there did seem to be some breakdown. You know, the governor agreed to the House Republican priorities, including the Medicaid work requirements, which he has already said that he was in favor of and pursuing. But that was a big point of contention, and we saw a lot of debates over that. Particularly, members of the Black Caucus took issue with that legislation. And, you know, I asked during that press conference, noticing there were several of those members who took issue with that proposal in the room. I asked, you know, did you explain to people that you already are in favor of work requirements, and where does that stand? And, you know, do you feel like you have the support of your party behind a position like that? And so I think that right now there are a lot of, I don't know, a lot of factions all over the place. Mm-hmm. You think of the governor, he is a Democrat, but he's not your traditional Democrat. He was, you know, one of the white rural Democrats when he was in the House. He remains anti-abortion, was in the military. And so there are a lot of these issues that he doesn't necessarily line up. And I think that for so long there was this kind of void in the Democratic Party here, where there was never really a question of who was in power, because there wasn't a lot of power to go around in the Democratic Party here. So right now, I think that they're just kind of going through some of those growing pains a little bit. And then obviously in the Republican Party, I think that part of that is just, you know, the moderate Republicans, and then you have the more right of that. And so there are some breakdowns that are still occurring, and people trying to reconcile with those differences.
Jim?
Take that a step further into a little bigger issue. You talked about the governor's problems relating to African Americans, and I don't know if you wrote about it. There was an article in the Advocate today about a major confrontation that was talked in the legislature involving Senator Conrad Appel, who's looked on as a fairly moderate gets things done senator, if I could be objective. I think it'd be objective to saying that, from New Orleans, and a state representative who I also think is from New Orleans. It starts with a B. What was his name? You remember, Elizabeth? Burt?
Yeah, Joe Bouet.
Okay, Bouet. And the question I want to ask you, I want your perception. You've been there, like say, covering the legislature since from 2014. How do you sense race relations in the legislature? Do they reflect what I would say in this state is that race relations are not very good in Louisiana today, and they're not very good nationally. But where I could look back on progress I observed as a public official in the late 1990s and going into early 2000, for a variety of reasons, there seems to be a stalemate and actually a lot more confrontation. Do you see the race issue at all? And I think the representative, Conrad Appels, brought up race in terms of reviewing charters. How do you think race plays into the flow of what you're reporting in the legislature?
You know, I don't sense a lot of disconnect as far as the rapport among members. I traditionally cover the House a lot more, especially lately because there have been so many budget issues, and that all gets started in the House. So I see, you know, a lot of rapport among the members, just how they deal with each other, you know, off of the floor, or you know, in I guess a more friendlier sense and everything. But their constituencies are very different, and the members of the Black Caucus are very much always going to look out for their constituencies, and that might not always jive with the constituencies of their Republican counterparts. And I think that at some level, race has to do with a lot of that's at the base of a lot of issues. But I don't see a lot of racial animosity. I think that what happened in Senate Education, the debate over charter schools is inherently racially charged, just because that's where it's gone, particularly in New Orleans. And I think that incident was very unfortunate, and I think that everybody feels that it was very unfortunate. I know that Senator Appel apologized afterward. I think that it was just it was a very intense debate, and things got heated there.
But I would suggest it's a very fair expression of how a number of people feel. African Americans have many Black American legislators and African Americans in general have some deep reservations about charter schools because of the fact that charters have more leeway in terms of disciplinary problems, getting rid of students, picking students. On the other hand, a number of non-African Americans feel like that was the whole purpose with charters in the first place, that if you wanted to do something more exceptional for your child or take more interest, you'd go to a charter school. So it's an issue that maybe there was some apologies, but and I'm not asking you to give social commentary, but I don't think that's going to go away. I think that's going to be a division for some time to come, and because I've not seen, you know, the division started out from the word get-go with charter schools. It hasn't seemed to resolve itself anymore.
So and I think it's I think it's interesting that there is a divide even among the Black Caucus of whether to support charter schools or not. And so I think that that's going to be another issue that we'll see play out. I think that a lot of this feeds into this push for a constitutional convention that we're seeing. That, you know, when you look at a constitutional convention, what money do you actually open up? It really opens up funding for public schools, and, you know, that ends up benefiting the charter schools in the long run, or it could, depending on who you get into a constitutional convention. So
I just put up a tweet,
and
unfortunately y'all can't see it, but everybody else can. And it's I actually retweet from LA Conservatives. It's the original tweet is from Scott McKay, Hayride. says North Carolina with a population, and Jim, you'll love this because of your relationship to North Carolina. You go to university there. North Carolina with a population of 10.27 million has a state budget of 23 billion. Louisiana with a population of 4.6 million has a state budget of 30 billion. Assuming these facts are accurate.
And if I could just jump in, I think I actually replied to that tweet and showed where that is not accurate. If you go to, I included a link to, it's the National Organization of State Budget Officers. You can see where those numbers come from. So that is actually Louisiana's state and federal budget, where it's North Carolina's general fund. So that doesn't include the federal funding.
So but I could elaborate a little bit more, Steve, and like you say, I'm very buoyant on North Carolina on many of their procedures in the insurance area. They're so far ahead of us in Louisiana. But I think here's where maybe information for the person that tweeted. If you look at the legislature, and that's one of the questions I was going to talk to Elizabeth about, we have so many things that are both require approval out of Baton Rouge that really are local matters, as well as funding. Let me give you the biggest example, of course, is the Superdome. I mean, no other state in America are there state funds that fund a dome stadium for a football team. In Dallas, Dallas, Texas gets some help, but the city of Arlington underwrote the bonds because they felt like that's where the stadium is. You can go right down the line. In Louisiana, every small group comes to the legislature and says, fund us, fund us, fund us. So if you combined the local spending and you combine the state spending, you'd see that things would even out a heck of a lot more, because in North Carolina, local governments don't come to Baton Rouge. Charlotte didn't come to Baton Rouge for their football team and their basketball team and many things they do in Charlotte. Their transportation, where many of the same cities traditionally, because of Huey Long, we have this populist government where you come to the state capital. So in answer to that tweet, that's another factor too, in terms of the fact that state and local together, you add them together, and we're not that far out of kilt with North Carolina.
Okay, so here's another tweet I want to put up. And basically, I don't know if y'all know this. It's breaking. This is from Julia O'Donoghue. Louisiana State Supreme Court rules 4-3 against the Louisiana governor on the LGBT protections for state workers and contracts. Jeff Landry wins court battle.
Yeah, well, that's interesting. I'm surprised, quite frankly, knowing the makeup of the Supreme Court,
Sure.
That issue is a lightning rod. And we mentioned North Carolina. So one of the key reasons that North Carolina that they moved the Final Four basketball tournament to New Orleans last year. So
Elizabeth, do you have any information about that? And thank you, Jim.
Yeah, we actually had that story on the Advocate first, but the Chief Justice, Chief Justice Johnson, she wrote a dissent to that. She wanted the court to take it up because she said that it's an issue that needs to be resolved. She compared it to, LSU has discrimination protections. And so she questioned, should we say that any state entity should not be able to create its own protections for diversity? And she brought up the states that have lost things like the Final Four because of that. Her dissent is very interesting to read. But yeah, it looks like a big win for Jeff Landry.
So they just they decided not to hear it. Is that
right?
Okay. So yeah,
right. The governor had appealed, asking them to take up the case, and they voted 4-3 to not take it up.
Right. Okay. So I'm going to read from Facebook some of the comments. Let's see. James Winston, thank you. Why no one is discussing Dale Atkins? Well, that's a appellate court race in New Orleans. Paul Hart Miller agreed to only extend half of the current temporary tax to fill the gap and tell folks that they voted for a tax cut, not an increase. A little coy there. From Paul Hart Miller. So agree to only extend half of the temporary tax to fill the gap and tell the folks that they voted for a tax cut. That's kind of messy.
I have heard that argument. When they were talking about it, they talked of it during the special session as a net reduction, and so really your taxes are going down, just not as much as they would.
Yeah, Jim, go ahead.
Well, the tax cut wasn't, brother, the tax increase was not permanent to begin with. Yeah. So it was going to expire 100%, not 50%. And so that's a nebulous argument that was not going to get swayed with the general public. And Steve, I've not been, again, you and I have debated this before. We've talked about this in the show before. I've never really been against revenue if it was fully justified, but you got to make your case. And I made that point before, and Elizabeth brought up the Constitution. I remember I was a delegate to the 1973 Constitutional Convention, and I know I, as a delegate, and in discussions with people, the governor himself and Bobby Henry, who was the Speaker of the House, was also chairman of the convention. We divided up the state. I must have made myself 75 or 100 speeches about why we should pass that Constitution. And the governor organized a huge grassroots effort. And that's not been done on revenue enhancements or anything involving his program. As a consequence, the average person out there, if I took a poll at the Chamber of Commerce in Faraday last night, and there was a number of African Americans and Democrats there, overwhelmingly, the vote would be against any type of more revenue coming in, more taxes. So those in charge have just not made their case from my perspective.
So Elizabeth, thank you. Elizabeth, let me ask you two questions. Number one, to piggyback on what Jim has, bear with me, my phone just went off. There it is. It's now dead. Thank you. So to piggyback on what Jim has just referred to, the Constitutional Convention, I've been hearing seeing a lot of Republicans saying, "Hey, this is not going to work. We don't need a constitutional convention." What is your take so far in terms of where that is, where that's going, a modified convention? And secondly, you wrote an article just, I think it went up today or yesterday, and it dealt with a survey, the Baton Rouge survey, the LSU. So if you could address those, please.
Yeah, I was just thinking of the survey. So it's the 2018 Louisiana survey, which is an annual polling that LSU's Public Policy Research Center does. And one of the interesting takeaways from that was 90% of the respondents said that state government could be cut without cutting services. That includes 50% of the 52% of the Democrats and more than 80% of the Republicans. So, it does seem like people, they don't understand, why does the state need more revenue? And you look at it, just 2 years ago, they did approve this temporary sales tax hike, and that was just to maintain services. People have been paying more taxes just to be able to keep the same stuff. And so I think that people are very skeptical of whether state government needs more money right now. As to the Constitutional Convention, Representative Franklin Foyle has, I know everybody loves a task force in Louisiana, but he has a bill that would create a task force to study the feasibility and what might be the best practices of how you select your delegates and when it would take place and all of that. I think that right now that's probably the most likely to make it through this session. Just kind of reading how things have been going as people have been debating it. But it is an idea that has been circulating a lot. It just, then you get to that same survey from LSU. It showed that when you ask people, do you think that protections for K through 12 funding should be protected? They say yes. And do you think transportation funding should be protected? And they say yes. Would you protect homestead Yes, or homestead exemption. So then you end up with, well, what are you really removing the, funding protections on? That's a whole lot of the money right there that people say they need to remove the dedications on.
If I can suggest a good story for you, Elizabeth, some of these very vehement voices that are opposing the Constitution from the legislature, I'd be interested to see, looking over their campaign financial statements, about the amount of vested interest money they receive from companies, from industries who get huge tax breaks in the Constitution, because that lobbying is taking place. They think a marvelous story for you to suggest your editor do an investigative report about key legislators and how much money they've been given in contributions to those who have these constitutional protections, because there's a lot of vested interest in this whole debate, quite frankly. And there was
good observation.
There was in 1973.
Yeah. Thanks.
So,
good suggestion for you.
Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you.
And Steve, I'll tell you, give you a little sidelight. I remember I was an elected delegate in 1973. Right. And my grandfather-in-law had been a delegate to the 1921 Constitutional Convention. And he told me, he says, get ready. He says, get ready, Jim. He says, you're going to have all these vested interests just going to be beating down your door. They want to stay in the Constitution. And he says, so you're going to have unbelievable. And he was right on. And that will be the same thing that happens this time around. If the Constitution looks like it's getting close to fruition.
So we have elections coming up. I'm assuming that in October, maybe earlier than that, some of the candidates for governor and other candidates in say the legislature are going to be promoting themselves big time. What have you seen anything at all? Have you seen anything coming out of the legislature right now that has election politics right on top of its forehead?
There's not anything that really springs to mind, but I feel like when you get into these general sessions, there are a lot of these bills that are obviously meant to kind of grab attention. I think it's kind of hard to say at this point, really who's kind of using that as politics. I know that the news about the Secretary of State Shedler, I think that caught a lot of people by surprise, and now people are kind of filling out. A lot of people are eyeing that. Right. There were. It's a little bit more exciting position than I think state treasurer was. Whenever there was everybody eyeing the state treasurer, the Secretary of State tends to get more attention and have a bit more, I guess, interesting duties. So I think there's going to be a lot of people trying to jump out to get some attention for that, now that we know that it'll be wide open. As far as governor, I don't really get the sense that you have people from the legislature who are trying to jump out to build recognition for governor. I think right now most of the attention is on people who've already won a statewide office, just because it's difficult to beat an incumbent governor if you don't have statewide recognition, or at least congressional recognition.
I haven't heard from the Louisiana Democratic Party or the Republican Party lately. I know we're 2 weeks in. We have a new chairman, and I think the new chairman actually made a statement after the session. Have you come across any, say, party politics coming from the chairperson, whether it's Louisiana Democratic or Republican Party? I know that Roger was very, very involved. Roger Villard was very involved with Jindal in terms of making sure that Governor Jindal's agenda got passed. And I'm just wondering whether or not you see any of that at this point.
Well, we did see Representative Harris, the GOP caucus chairman in the House. He released a video earlier this week, along with a statement about the House Republican caucus's desire to try to solve the fiscal cliff through cuts first. And it also included a comment from the party chairman. I think that because they just had the chairman elections, things are still kind of getting their footing, especially him being from New Orleans. I think that there's a little bit of adjusting to try to get the party. Although it seems to be, it was a pretty smooth transition because Villery did back his candidacy. But we haven't seen, at least I haven't seen a whole lot out there yet. And the Democrats have been, Karen Carter Peterson, she is a senator, so she's active during the session. But the party seems to be right now, the Democrats seem to be pretty focused on trying to do more local outreach in communities. I know they've held several events trying to encourage people to run for office or get involved in the party on the local level.
Okay, Jim, we have time for, I think, maybe 2 questions. Go ahead and ask yours. And
Yeah, Elizabeth, interesting too. I just wonder how much of this you're seeing. It just strikes me that the legislature is trying to continue to fine tune and do so much and get involved in local issues and almost making stuff up. I mean, the bills I've read, quite frankly, could be adjusted by laws that are already in effect. Hazing, for example. Hazing is a crime, and yet we've got to make a special crime for fraternity hazing. I saw in New Orleans, several legislators continue to put in legislation that just affects New Orleans. We saw, I think,
here in Baton Rouge, we have legislation that specifically addresses the location of the Baton Rouge Zoo. There are bills that are actually filed to try to change where the zoo is, or make sure that the zoo is not moved in Baton Rouge. So yeah, there's some odd things.
Shreveport legislators are going to vote on where the zoo's located in Baton. Crazy. And yet I had some folks tell me in the last week or two, you could almost do away with this entire session, and outside of finances, if you got the finances okay, why are they even meeting? They're making up stuff, or they're addressing problems that really don't exist, and or could be taken care of with other sections of the law. And is it really necessary? What, shouldn't they be taking a break and you be on vacation over in Florida right now?
It'd be nice if I could take a vacation or know when I might be able to take a vacation.
Absolutely. So the last question for our session, and again, thank you so much. I really do appreciate it. And I just saw the article that you wrote on the LGBT. So that's up on the Advocate.
Mark Ballard.
Okay, gotcha. But I saw you tweet then. Okay, gotcha. Mm-hmm. Is all people? We see the legislative session. Based upon what Jim was talking about, we see the session, it kind of goes very slow, and suddenly there's an issue that just starts burning up everything, and back in, I think, 2009, it was the pay, increasing the legislative pay, and then it was tobacco back in 2013, 12, or something like that. Do you see anything on the way, or hear anything on the way of a really hot button issue other than, say, the taxes, which is not this session? Do you see anything that could really, really burn a hole in everybody's TV?
I'm not so sure yet. We are starting to see quite a bit of interest in the gambling legislation. So that could emerge as a big issue. There's been a little bit of attention on it with some of the bills starting to advance out. I don't think that that's anything that's just really caught fire with the public yet. So I'm not sure you know, talking to people in the Capitol, everyone is so focused on the budget, and there's all the talk about the fiscal cliff, and it really does seem to be still sucking up a lot of the air in the room, particularly after the special session, and with this possibility of another special session, likelihood of another special session looming over everybody.
Okay. Well, listen, thank you so much, Elizabeth. Chris.
Yeah, thanks
really
for having me on.
Terrific. It's been a lot of fun. Absolutely. And would love to have you back on
yeah,
soon.
definitely.
Really, maybe a Friday wrap. And those people watching, please go ahead and share. Those people who are going to watch it afterwards, go ahead and share and like. And go feel free to ask questions, make comment, and we'll try to get that information over to Elizabeth. Jim, thank you again. I appreciate your wisdom and experience as both a state senator, insurance commissioner, and secretary of state.
Thank you, Steve. Enjoyed being with you today.
Okay, so why don't you guys hold on? I'm going to say goodbye by pushing a couple buttons and tell everybody goodbye, and bear with me.